What is the strangest mystery that is still unsolved? I remember seeing a video about a woman that after getting divorced, started getting stalked and assaulted in her own house. Every time police would arrive, no one more than her was at the scene. Sometimes she would appear with bruises, once she appeared with a screwdriver through her hand. This happened so many times that police started ignoring her calls after the investigation on her husband and on the case left no suspects. 3 months later she disappeared just to reappear next to a highway in the middle of the desert, miles away from her house, with her hands tied, dead. Autopsy later confirmed she was beaten to death. Creepiest shit I know. The Circleville Letters. In 1976, residents of the small city south of Columbus, Ohio began receiving handwritten sinister and graphic letters. Each letter included secret and dark details about their personal lives. One resident received a ton of letters, accusing her of various unsavory acts. The author warned the resident that he had been keeping an eye on her home, as well as her comings and goings. The resident was horrified and tried to keep the letters a secret until her husband began receiving them. The attacks on the family continued, with large posters appearing around town spreading rumors about their 12-year-old child. One day in 1977, the husband left the house after receiving a call from who he thought was writing the letters. A few minutes later, the husband was found dead at the end of the street, dead behind the wheel. The sheriff had ruled it a homicide when he realized that a single shot had been fired before the accident, but there was no evidence that the husband was shot at the site. The sheriff found the husband was twice the legal limit and ruled it a drunk driving accident. The letters began once again, this time accusing the sheriff of covering up the true nature of the death. The letters also accused the sheriff of mishandling an investigation into the county coroner who had been accused of other grotesque acts. The harassment continued, this time with signs along the road, and in 1983, the original resident who had been accused of having an affair pulled over to remove a sign. During the effort to remove the sign, she discovered a box was attached, and inside of it was a small pistol. The gun was part of a booby trap designed to fire when the sign was removed. Paul Fresauer was arrested and given 25 years. But one small problem. The letter writing continued even after Fresauer was put in jail. In a new batch of letters, the author had promised to dig up the grave of a deceased baby and mail the bones to the police in the case of another potential affair-turned-murder. Hundreds of residents continued to receive personal letters until 1994, when everything stopped. On April 19, 1995, a truck bomb detonated outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. The explosion killed 168 in what was the deadliest terrorist attack on the United States until 9/11. To date, it still remains the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in the country. One of the lesser-known things about this is the case of the missing leg. Investigators discovered the leg laying among the rubble and identified it belonging to Laksha Levy. The only problem was, she'd already been buried with both her legs. She was exhumed, her severed leg was placed in her coffin while the other leg was taken to the FBI laboratory for identification. Since it had been embalmed, a DNA sample was unable to be obtained. The extra left leg, which had been mistakenly buried with Levy, is suspected to belong to an unidentified 169th victim, whose body had mostly disintegrated in the blast. This has led people to suspect there was an additional terrorist involved, even though perpetrators Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols had been convicted, with 2 others later identified as accomplices. So who was the possible additional bomber? They still remain unidentified now, 25 years after the attack. 3 lighthouse workers with impeccable mustaches traveled to a remote island on December 7, 1900 for a lighthouse shift that should have lasted for 2 weeks. When a boat arrived to pick them up, they were gone. No trace of the bodies, and the lighthouse was strangely locked. Not only was the setting normal meal ready to be served, but there was no fire in the fireplace, and the clock stopped. One of the men kept a log in a diary. And he said that the seas were rough one day, but when monitored, it was actually calm. No one knows what happened to them. Freak wave, almost certainly. Been to Flanone, lovely place, courtesy of a local fisherman who told me all about this mystery and frankly, scared the living heck out of me. I'll share what he told me, most of which checks out with records of the time. During the search for those quite wonderful missing mustaches, the following was noted: 1/ a box over 100 feet above sea level had been wave damaged, and iron railings at the same level had been bent. 2/ the railway lines serving the lighthouse had been ripped out of their concrete settings. 3/ and this is my favorite bit. There is a nearby cliff over 200 feet high. It was still there, but the grass on top of the cliff had been ripped away. 4 up to 30 feet back from the cliff edge. Arguing that it was where the wave broke. The local view is that by freak chance all the keepers were outside and below the 200 feet above sea level. Mark doing keeper stuff when they suddenly noticed it had gone dark and looked up just in time to see a wave over 200 feet high about to hit them. Probably had time to say something along the lines of "goodness gracious me. And now I'll never have time to finish that letter to Martha, and that would be it." This seems plausible to me. I was on vacation in Maine as a teenager. We were in Acadia National Park on a rocky cliff. Probably about 50 plus feet above the water line. We were taking pictures and being tourists. Every once in a while, the water would hit the rocks hard enough that we would get some spray. But one wave knocked me off my feet, spun me around, and pushed me under some trees about 20-some feet from the edge of the rocks. I was completely submerged, and when the water started to recede, I drifted closer to the shore. I had no perception of where I was or what was happening, but I felt the direction of the water change and thought I was going to wash off the cliff and into the water, so I started desperately grasping for anything to save me. I'm ripping clumps of grass out of the earth just trying to stay on the shore. When everything settled and my ears stopped ringing, I heard my dad screaming my name like bloody murder. My mom was screaming my name too, but it just came out as a blood-curdling wail. I coughed and sputtered until I could get loud enough to draw their attention. By then my dad was looking into the water and was about to dive in when they heard me. He said that he had been knocked off his feet and into the rocks, and he has a bone spur in his knee to prove it. My mom was slammed into the rocks and ended up on her hands and knees holding on to the rocks. Either my brother or sister ended up closer to the shore than where they started. When everything washed away, my dad was looking for everybody and saw everyone was more or less okay. But when he turned around to look for me, who was higher up on the rocks and behind everybody on the trail, I was just gone. My shoes were swept out to sea, all our cameras were drowned and my cell phone was waterlogged, but we somehow got it back to life. That thing was a tank. My glasses were gone too, and my eyes were already too weak to use a pharmacy-of-the-shelf pair. Somehow they didn't wash out to sea with my shoes. But I had to be lead out by someone holding my hand because they were so covered in pine tar that I couldn't use them. We found a public restroom in the park where we could change our soaking wet clothes. We were also bogged down with pine needles, pine tar, and wet dirt. That when we were done changing, it looked like someone had shit liquid everywhere. One of us was supposed to go outside and get something so we could wash it down the drain in the middle of the floor. But some women came in behind us. They started screaming because of what they thought was a hazmat team's worst nightmare. We had to explain to them what happened. I think if we weren't so drenched and I was shivering uncontrollably, they would not have believed us. The Overtown Bridge. It's a bridge in Scotland where dogs always unexplainably jump off. It's very strange and nobody knows for certain why they do this. Dogs who survived reportedly walked back up and jumped off again. They even had to put up a warning sign to keep your dog on a leash and to watch them. A lot of theories say maybe it's because of certain scents or animals down below, but most people have disagreed with this theory. It's fucking weird. The Salish Seafeet or the Madagasman of New Orleans. The Salish Seafeet are the approximately 20 dismembered feet found in or around British Columbia or Washington, USA. The feet sometimes are found still inside of shoes. No one knows how they got there or where they came from. Over the course of the last 13 years, the authorities have ruled out foul play. The Madagasman of New Orleans ran rampant in 1918 and 1919. He murdered 6 people, usually those of Italian descent, with axes or straight razors. In March of 1919, he sent a lengthy letter from hottest hell that was pretty nonsensical. But the most relevant paragraphs read: "Now, to be exact, at 12:15, earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on this specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe." There were no murders that night because every dance hall in NOLA was filled to capacity.